Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Governance and Management of External Users in Microsoft 365 with our special guest, Rene Modery. My name is Patrick, and I'm a sales manager here at Syskit. We will be soon joined by Rene and later my colleague Mattia, who will be showing you a demo of Syskit Point. Many of you already know us as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce you to Syskit. Syskit is a software development company founded more than 12 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance, security, and auditing, as well as for SharePoint on-prem administration. We currently have more than 3,000 customers around the world. We offer 5 products, including our famous SP.Kit for SharePoint on-prem documentation, as well as Syskit Point for Microsoft 365 governance. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After Rene's presentation, we will have a short demo of Syskit Point showing you how it can improve your management of both external and internal users. We will then have a Q&A session where Rene will answer any questions you may have. So please don't be shy. Use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest. Rene Modery is a Microsoft Office Apps and Services MVP working as an APAC collaboration and productivity tools project manager in Singapore. For more than 15 years, Rene has lived and worked in Europe and Asia Pacific. The main focus of his work lies on Microsoft 365 and the Power Platform. He's generally interested in helping companies get more value out of their Microsoft 365 and cloud investments. I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to Rene. Rene, are you ready?
Hi, yes, and I'm just checking. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Two important questions.
We
Excellent.
can see it.
Excellent, good. All right, then good morning, good afternoon, good evening from my side as well. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are located. I want to talk about a topic today that's quite dear to my heart because I've been basically dealing with it for a couple of years regularly in various ways. And I want to talk about external users in Microsoft 365 and how you can govern and manage them. So Patrick already just gave a short introduction about myself. There's not too much more to add on. So I'm actually based in Singapore in the far eastern part of the world. It's 10 p.m. here in the evening. Wonderful time to have a webinar. Kids are asleep and I've got finally some quiet time here to share some experiences with everybody. So I've been working with SharePoint for around 15 years and with Office 365 since 2011, so quite some time. And I've been a Microsoft Office 365 MVP since 2012. So I've been working in the Microsoft ecosystem, you could say, basically my whole career. And that career actually brought me, or started, you could say, within Asia Pacific, brought me back to Europe at some point. I'm originally from Germany. And I came back to Singapore then. And my work experience, to a large extent, was always with larger companies, either in regional roles or global roles. Right now, I'm part of WPP, a very large global organization with around 140,000 employees, I think, worldwide, spread across a couple of different operating companies, etc. And as part of my role so far, I've been dealing mainly with Office 365 and more now with the Power Platform. But generally speaking, one of the things that I dealt with before, what I looked at before quite often in different ways was, for example, in the current role as well as in previous roles, again, how can we actually manage external users within Office 365 effectively? So let's actually talk about that in more detail, and let's start with it from a more organizational point of view, not so much the technical point of view. So when we talk about an organization and external users, we need to think about why are there external users actually involved. So what we have is usually as an organization, we're not just operating within our small company only, but obviously we're working together with a lot of different other people, with a lot of other companies for various different reasons. Just imagine, for example, you're a small company selling cat toys, you're called Kitty Fun Toys. You're not just basically doing everything by yourself, but obviously you need to do something with other companies as well then. So those externals could be located in different kinds of industries, in different kinds of regions, locations, etc. And your relationship with them can be based on different, pillars. So it could be, for example, the factory that produces your products. It could be a shipping company, for example, that helps you bring your products from the factory to the physical stores where you're actually selling them. You might have actually also some relationship, obviously, with those physical stores, because you're not just saying, oh, I've got some products here that I'm storing in our warehouse and maybe people can buy something from us, but rather you put your products out there in maybe some larger retailers or so, and maybe you've got some relationship with those retailers then to get your products out there. Or you might also have some online platform relationship with another company to make sure that, oh, your online sales can also be handled directly through you, through that through a website, mobile app, something like that. All that involves maybe also, for example, a lot of legal paperwork, etc. So you might be engaging with a legal external company because you don't have the in-house expertise. Maybe your IT systems are not managed by you fully, but partially by some other external parties. Maybe you, I don't know, make use of some software as a service product somewhere. Maybe you're, I don't know, hosting something in Azure. Maybe you've got some other data center that you're using, etc. You might have people maintaining your website, doing some other coding for you, or so, some other kind of freelancers. You might have designers working for you to prepare your advertisements, to clean up your brochures, to fancy them up, etc. And you might also have a relation with some end customers, maybe not the cat directly, but the owner of the cat then. So you might have maybe some focus groups asking them, hey, we want to regularly get some feedback from you regarding some potential new products that we're going to launch, etc. So long story short, as a company, you've got a lot of different relationships with a lot of different external companies in different ways. And the way you're working with them actually then also means then there's a lot of data flowing back and forth. When you just look at everybody that you have here, you can imagine there are lots of documents usually involved, for example, when it comes to shipping manifests, when it comes to orders, when it comes to, I don't know, contracts, a lot of things. And usually, obviously, what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, okay, send me everything by email. I'm going to send you a vision back again, etc. But rather then you're thinking about, okay, how can we do something like that more efficiently? And that's when basically then some IT systems come in. So what do you then actually do, for example, as an individual within an organization? So what you might be doing is then, for example, if just seen some of those use cases, maybe you're working with an external freelancer and you're saying, hey, external freelancer, I need some help with a brochure that we now need to get done, basically, that we want to basically hand out as part of some, maybe some, I don't know, some special sales or so in some physical stores. So maybe we just need to get something done here. So it's really something that's happening not on a regular basis, just you could say a one-time activity for the moment. So what you do is maybe you need to share some content with that external freelancer. You put that content in a location and share that content then with the external party then. And again, that's more of a one-to-one thing right now. So not involving a whole lot of different people internally and not a whole lot of people externally, but rather really it's one person sending someone outside the organization basically a file. And that's the, simply said, again, the replacement of I'm sending you an email with the attachment. No, rather you say, hey, here's the file that you can then download and access and maybe even update, etc. But then, of course, we've got also something where it's getting a bit more complex. We've got something that's happening more often, more regularly, which we've seen before. So you're not just saying, oh, I'm going to share one file with the factory and another file with the factory team and a third file with the factory team individually. But you think about, oh, we've got something going on regularly here. So we know we've got an internal team, couple of people that are involved here. And as part of that long-term relationship with the external party that we have, we need to do something quite often. So we might share a lot of different content in a lot of different ways here then through maybe a central repository. So the external team then also might not just consist of one person, but also a couple of different people, maybe more, maybe less sometime, maybe someone new joins, etc. Apologies. But the idea is then you've got one central place that everybody can go to, where everybody sees all the content that is relevant for that relationship. And they can always then obviously review what has been shared previously. They can update things, add new content, all those kind of things. And while I use the Teams logo here, obviously, I mean, it's meant to be a placeholder. It doesn't have to be Microsoft Teams, but it is one of the possible locations where I say, yes, there is some regular collaboration happening. And when you think about it, obviously, I mean, we're not just talking about one team within an organization, but we've got a lot of teams working with externals in a lot of different ways. Just think about all the different individual bits and pieces that get shared with externals on an individual basis, how many internal teams that you have that collaborate with externals on a regular basis in some way. It may be projects, it may be, again, based on regular contracts or so that you have. So there's a whole lot of things happening. And the idea then basically is that you've got then really a lot of basically, how to call it, there's a lot of information getting shared back and forth. You've got then the externals that you then basically work with quite regularly. And you're starting to think about, I want to basically standardize it in such a way that we're not just using, I don't know, 10 different systems with our external parties, with the vendors, clients, customers, etc. But rather we want to standardize it a bit because we want to put some controls in place, or maybe we want or need to put some controls in place. You don't want to just say, oh yeah, if you want to share a file with an externals, it can be email or Dropbox or Box or Teams, or maybe you've got an FTP server somewhere, or there's some other service that somebody else is hosting. I can just quickly upload a file, then people can access it. But you need to think about basically a couple of different things then where you make sure that, hey, anything that is happening here from a collaboration perspective, you want it to be well managed and well controlled. Not controlled in the sense of you want to check every single thing that is happening, but you want to put some guardrails in place that ensure that you minimize the risk to your organization and the risk to the external party, and you still ensure that the collaboration can be done as much as possible in a very simple manner. So what do you as an organization then actually need to consider? We've seen, for example, a company working with a lot of different external companies, a lot of different external individuals. But do you want to generally allow that collaboration should be just open, so you can really work with anyone outside, regardless of who they are? Should it be now really, once you say yes, we allow sharing content with externals, then to really just want it to be basically accessible by theoretically everyone that you want to share content with? Or do you say, no, we rather want to contain the risk a bit, and we want to make sure that whoever we collaborate with, we actually go through maybe some sort of approval and review process, and then allow specifically to collaborate with them through our system. So that might mean, for example, when you say, oh, you might want to really allow collaboration directly with company C and company B for example, but company A and company D are potentially considered competitors. So obviously you don't want them to enter your system and have a look at your data or be invited, for example. So maybe you'd say, no, those we want to block actually. So that's one important thing that you need to think about in terms of, do you want to be a bit more of an open organization, or are there certain reasons why you actually want to put some, again, some guardrails into place and make sure that you don't just let anyone in, but rather you control who should be allowed to be worked with. Another thing is then obviously that you then need to think about those people that you work with. So when you set, again, for example, set something up that an external party has access to, do you want them to have access to it permanently, or should that be reviewed periodically? If I share a file now with somebody external, let's say it's a contract, should that external's access to that contract be reviewed, for example, every 3 months, 6 months, every year or so? Is that something that might be important? What if that external actually leaves his organization and he's gone? How do you know that his account actually is still required to have access to your contract? You wouldn't know, maybe potentially. Obviously, you don't want to follow everybody out on the outside world to see, are they still around, etc. But rather you want to put something in place to review that access. And more importantly also, who should perform that review? When you've got something, for example, getting sent for internal or external review, then does the external person need to, for example, confirm, yes, I still need access to the contract that was shared with me, for example, or I still need access to the system that was shared with me? Or should somebody internally, for example, say, yes, this external party should still be allowed to access the content that we have located within, for example, here, the operations group within Contosa as an example. So there's some considerations that need to be done actually, and you need to think about it carefully in terms of really, when content gets shared, you really want to make sure that when something gets shared, you might want to review again on a regular basis. Is it still necessary, or should we basically then remove the access or restrict the access? That brings me also then, for example, to the next step then. When you share content, I can share something with 5 different people. My colleague shares something with 10 different people. Should the organization know about it, that I shared that content? Yeah, ideally, it should be possible to report on that. So if I invite now 5 people into our team, for example, and another colleague invites another 10 people into a team, the organization ideally should know that there's something happening here. And obviously, you might really need to know actually who are those people that you're working with? Who are they? What are they doing? What do they have access to? Because when you open up your environment, you want to make sure then, for example, that you've got the overview overall of what is happening generally. Because, and that's now the important part, you might say, hey, within our organization, our accounts are secured, we've got MFA in place, we've got a lot of login in place, etc. So we're trying to be secure as possible. But once you share, for example, a Microsoft Teams team with somebody external, invite them to it, how can you make sure then that this invited external is who he claims to be? What if the external account actually gets compromised? You want to know about it. Obviously, what does that person have access to? What has that person been doing recently or so? And that might be actually an increased risk then for your organization if one of those external accounts gets compromised. And yeah, that brings me then to the next step then. How do you know what the external has been doing in your environment? Obviously, you don't just invite them, think, yeah, they'll be fine. They won't do anything bad. Nothing bad will happen or so. But you might want to know actually, hey, what if, I mean, worst case, if somebody reports, hey, our account has been compromised from an external perspective, you might have been impacted as well. You might want to know, hey, what has that impacted external account been doing in our environment? Did they access any content? Did they view any sensitive information? Did they maybe modify something or so? You really want to know that. So that's the important part then, because you really don't just want to assume that everything should be fine or so, but rather you want to make sure then obviously that if your data gets accessed, you know about it if required. And that's something where it could be a bit more proactive or a bit more reactive. I mean, proactive always sounds good, but requires a lot more operational tasks, obviously. Being a bit more reactive doesn't mean that it's bad, but you should still be able to actually then check and verify what has been going on in your environment. So that brings me all to the 2 key questions basically then, and that's basically a summary is, number 1, who is in your tenant? So tenant Office 365 tenant then. So who are those externals that have been invited to collaborate with you? And then more importantly, also, how do you manage them accordingly? Because you don't just want to say, yes, we'll bring them in and then they are there, but rather you want to make sure that you manage them well so that the risk to your organization is minimized, but also the collaboration between the external teams and the internal teams is not stifled in any way. And the other thing is obviously then also you want to know those people that have been invited, you want to know what do they actually have access to? What can they do and see in your environment? Do they have access to 10 SharePoint sites, to 1 SharePoint site only? Have they been shared, I don't know, some other content in OneDrive somewhere? Ideally, you want to know this. And basically what you also need to know is then how can you report on this? And that's something that we'll also have a look at in a couple of minutes. Which brings me then to that technical view now. So you should have a good understanding now of obviously how organizations collaborate with external parties. And from a technical view now, how does it now work within the Microsoft ecosystem? So first of all, in the tech stack, we've got the identity. So I keep mentioning the externals and the internals, but who are they? So internally, usually then your identity is then hosted within Azure AD. So your accounts are located in there, and what you have is then, for example, when you create a new Office 365 account or Microsoft 365 account, then you also get your corresponding Azure AD account, basically, that powers then the whole Microsoft Cloud stack here. That also actually is the same then for the external. So when you invite an external into your tenant to collaborate with you, for example, you say you set up a new team and you invite some externals to work with you in that specific team, maybe they already have an Office 365 account, then it's quite easy. They might just get added to your tenant as a guest with that identity. Or if they don't have, that can still happen, that they basically get added as an individual guest account still into your Azure AD, even though they might not have an Office 365 account yet. Overall, what it really means is any collaboration within your tenant, all the identities, being it internal or external, they all end up in Azure AD. And that basically provides then the basis then for accessing and sharing your content. So the content could then be in various locations. And what we're going to look at and think about is obviously then, hey, what you do is you invite, for example, again, as mentioned, an external party or multiple people from external party into a team in Microsoft Teams that was set up for maybe a specific project or a specific initiative for some other long-term relationship. Or you might share a file individually with somebody through OneDrive, as we've seen before. And lastly, obviously, you could also use a SharePoint site that you then open up to externals so that they can contribute with you. For example, you might invite some, a partner that you work with regularly to a SharePoint site to contribute you there to maybe add some, I don't know, news articles, some useful information, that kind of thing, basically. So that could also be possible. So I just gave a brief explanation of the external users already. And what we have basically is then within Office 365, as mentioned, Azure AD is the identity provider. And any account that basically accesses your Teams, your SharePoint, your OneDrive also gets stored or is located within Azure AD. You have your internal accounts, but you've also got something called a guest account. So the guest account is then that account internally that gets created when you invite somebody from the outside world. And you can see an example here. So you can see a snapshot of Azure AD where we filtered by user type equals guest. And we can see a different, you see a couple of different guests here. You also see the identity issue, for example, who was it who actually created that actual account? So we know, for example, there are a couple of accounts that are located in external Azure AD, so they are likely using Office 365 as well. We see a Microsoft account here, for example, so that's then basically the non-work account, so what's it called, the personal account. But we can also see that there are some, for example, that are listed differently. Either way, it doesn't matter what they are. What we know is they're all guests. So those are externals that have been invited into a tenant in some way at some point in time so that they can then basically access some kind of content within your Office 365 environment. And just to note, basically, you might have seen that already here, but if you look closely, for example, in this tenant here, we've got more than 100,000 external guests. So just think about basically what we've seen before, the scenario, you share a file with somebody and you invite some people in your team. Depending on the size of your organization, obviously, and how much you collaborate with others, that number can go up quite a lot. And the key factor here then really is that, if you are a very small organization with, I don't know, 5 to 10 employees and you invite some externals, management of that can be quite simple or relatively simple. So you can do a lot of things manually then. But the bigger you are, the more external users you have, obviously, anytime something gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you want to make sure that it becomes scalable and that it becomes manageable in an easy manner. And that's when you need to look at automation. So what you want to do then is basically for all those guest accounts, and that's just a quick recommendation actually, they might already have, for example, if they're Office 365 account, they might already have some security set up on their end. But one key thing generally to protect your company is always set up MFA. And while you might say, I'm going to set up MFA for all my internal accounts, obviously, because Microsoft said MFA can block over 99.9% of account compromise attacks, don't forget the guests. the guests, if you don't actually enable MFA for them, but you invite them into your tenant, they pose a certain risk still. I mean, for an external, what it means when they try to access content within your environment, they might have to go through an additional step. What we can see on the right side, they need to set up MFA once. They might need to approve then the sign-in request regularly once they access your environment. They might not always like it. I mean, nobody likes it when they get a MFA prompt after MFA prompt after MFA prompt, but it's one of those things that should be done generally. And that's just a quick note regarding guest accounts here. More important now is, I mean, we now know that there are the guest accounts, etc., and you want to now allow sharing of your content, meaning the content within OneDrive, within SharePoint, and in a way also within Teams. How can you control and manage that? That's one important thing, because there are different ways how that can be set up, and there are a few different controls for you available. So the very, very first thing you should be doing is in your Office 365 tenant, in the SharePoint Admin Center, there's some policies that you can define for sharing. And those allow you to set the sharing level on the organizational level, really within your organization. And you can see basically you got here content can be shared with SharePoint OneDrive, and you've got a few different options. The most permissive option is called anyone. So users can share files and folders using links that don't require sign in. That sounds awesome. I mean, you can just create a quick link to a file that you have here and share it with somebody external, and they don't need to sign in. They can just access it directly. Wonderful, right? But what if that link gets shared with somebody else and makes its way around the internet? And suddenly you've got a whole lot of people accessing content and you have no idea that they do and who they even are, who access it. So while this can be done, obviously, that you say, yes, content can be shared with anyone, most organizations might want to turn that off. My apologies. What you usually want to do is you want to restrict the sharing because you want to know who content gets shared with. So if I share a file in OneDrive with somebody, I need to specify who that person is by specifying an email address. So then we've got some options here. We can say either we want to share with new and existing guests. So that means then I want to share a file now with somebody that we never worked with before. So I can just simply then say, yes, I add that person then to my sharing link. That person then gets an email. They need to provide a verification code. All good. They can access my file. But you might also want to say, no, actually, we want to control it a bit more. We don't just want to allow sharing with externals, but every single external that we want to share with, we want to control actually whether they should have access or not. So taking it one step further, and you say only existing guests are allowed in your organization's directory. So remember just now you saw the slide with the 100,000 external accounts. Obviously, when you say existing guests in the organization's directory are allowed to have access, somebody needs to review them, somebody needs to approve them, somebody needs to basically add them to your directory, etc. That might be a big operational task. So you've got a trade-off here. Do you want to allow sharing more openly, or do you want to control who gets shared with here? No recommendation on what is the better option. That obviously always depends on each organization. Some organizations say, yes, we've got something in place so we can control it more tightly. And that's actually what we require due to, I don't know, maybe legal and compliance reasons. Other organizations say, no, actually, new and existing guest sounds awesome. That's what we're going to use. Again, no recommendation specifically what you should use here, just that anyone is obviously a high risk. The last item, only people in your organization, is then obviously the far opposite of being very open when it comes to sharing. That one simply means, oh no, you don't let anyone share content with anyone externally. So nothing that we will talk about here today. So the key question then basically, again, as mentioned, is how open do you want to be? Do you want to control it a bit, or do you want to restrict it in a way who you want to share with? And for this part, then we've also got some more settings here. And I can't emphasize enough how important the settings that are presented on this slide here are. So again, they're also on the same page in the SharePoint Admin Center on the policy sharing. here you've got further controls in place that allow you to do some more fine-grained definition of what do you allow within your environment. For example, let's look at the, where is it? Sorry, the one that has been ticked here, obviously, the one that I ignored most of the time now. Allow guests to share items they don't own. If you allow this, that means you invite a guest and they could be allowed then to share something that has been shared with them again. That's obviously something that you might not want to do. So ideas then, well, I don't want to call it a strong recommendation, but a very carefully to be considered item here is really, you might want to turn this one off. As for the others, that's where you then need to think about how much control do you want to actually have within your environment and how much do you actually need to implement or want to implement. And there might be, again, some compliance or legal reasons, but what you really want to do is then go through each and every one of them and think about, is this something that we should be doing? Does this provide value to us? And if we do it, does it make sense? For example, the first one, limit external sharing by domain. So maybe you say, oh, we only want to share with certain approved external companies. So we only want to share with, for example, Syskit. We only want to share with Microsoft, and we don't want to share with anyone else right now unless it has been reviewed by maybe our legal department or so. That's where you could do it and then say, yes, I'm only allowing Microsoft.com and Syskit.com as an example. Obviously, if you don't limit it, that means can be shared with anyone. So you can share with Syskit, Microsoft, Gmail, Google, etc., 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 any external email address. And you can see there are a range of other settings here that allow you then to do some further sharing controls, define them. For example, we can see also that some access might expire after a certain period of time. And that's also one important thing here in terms of any content that gets shared, you might want to get it actually reviewed periodically again. That's something I mentioned earlier. So one thing here again, maybe you want to say, hey, access to a SharePoint site or OneDrive, for example, should expire automatically after 60 days, 90 days, 180 days. Because if it's still required after that period of time, then maybe you just need to go through a process again. Or, for example, you don't want to do that, so you just leave it as it is because, you know, maybe you've got some other thing, some other system in place that can help you with it. But the idea is, again, you think about from a security point of view, from a compliance point of view, from a ease of use point of view. For each of those settings, does it make sense for your organization to do that? Or is it something that you say, it sounds good, but yeah, I'm just going to leave it as it is for a moment and revisit maybe at a later stage in time. And I'm only talking about a few couple of things, but you could even take it a lot of steps further in terms of, for example, when you set up your security policies, you could think about a whole zero trust architecture. And you can see within Azure AD, because we know all the accounts are powered by Azure AD, you could set up certain conditional access policies. So not just allowing, hey, we allow sharing with external clients, that's all good, but maybe also additional restrictions. Maybe you have something where you say, oh, maybe you include a certain policy that something can only be accessed from for example, specific devices, meaning only your internally handed out devices are allowed to access, for example, certain SharePoint sites as an example. So there are lots of things that could be done here as well, but that's something that we could probably talk hours about. So just a quick reminder, whatever I'm talking about today is not comprehensive, it's not inclusive. It gives you hopefully some ideas. You get hopefully some new things to look at. But once you start looking at it, there's always a lot more that you can think about, and you need to see basically where's the trade-off. Does it make sense for us to do something when we're just 10 people? Yeah, all of that is too complicated. If you're an organization of, I don't know, 30,000 people in the finance industry, yes, there are probably a lot of regulations that we need to fulfill. So we should look at a lot of that in more detail and implement it potentially even soonest. All right, so now when it comes to, we put in some guardrails in place, allowing us to share with externals. We can invite them to our environment. We can share SharePoint site with them, etc., etc. We also want to know, again, how many guests do we have? So again, basically, we can see on the left side here the screenshot of Azure AD of the directory with our 100,000 plus guest accounts. But you could also then say, oh, that's one way to do it. Maybe you need to do it, I don't know, maybe you need to export it periodically. So ideally, you don't want to log in every day and say, I want to bulk operations, export everybody here and download the file. But you could also do it periodically. Maybe you need to basically get that number, how many externals do we have, and put it in some other system or do something with it for further purposes or so. There are ways then how you can access that obviously as well to get some more information about that. PowerShell is one option. You see a simple commandlet on the right side. It just gives you the display name and the email of every single guest user that is available in your tenant. There are obviously then also other ways how that can be done overall. As it's in Azure AD, programmatic access is not an issue at all. There are many different ways how that can be done, and depending on your needs, then there are many things that you can do here. So figuring out how many guests you have, not an issue, but you need to think about, is it something that you only want to know, I don't know, once a month or once a quarter for management reporting purposes? So yeah, then you can just quickly check it. Do you need to perform some actions on it on a daily basis? Yes, then obviously you need to automate it in some way. The next step then obviously is then we also need to figure out what does a specific guest have access to? And that's now the big question. If you invite me to your tenant and another colleague invites me to your tenant as well, and a third colleague invites me to your tenant, how do you know all the things that I have access to? You could obviously ask everybody, hey, what did we give Rene access to, etc. But that's not going to work with even a few people, and even more not so with a couple of thousand or 10,000 of external guests. So to figure out then what do externals have access to, individually, you could obviously check, yeah, I've got a SharePoint site or a Microsoft team, and I can go in there and check the permissions on the top level. So I can see who are the people that have been invited. I can also go to a specific file or folder then inside, for example, that SharePoint site and check, oh, this one has been shared separately, a sharing link has been generated. I can check who it has been shared with. Within OneDrive, we've also got those controls in place. You can easily check which files I shared with somebody, and I even can download a more comprehensive sharing report. But the big issue is obviously, I mean, you don't have the detailed overview of what's actually happening. There's no comprehensive overview, no detailed report that tells you, okay, Rene has got access to 55 different files through some sharing links. He's been invited to 10 different SharePoint sites. Oh, and basically there's also one other team that he has been added to, and that kind of information is not easily possible. It's not possible to do that within Microsoft 365 anywhere directly. They say, I'm going to run a report against Rene and check what he has access to. No. What you would need to do is basically run your own reporting, and that becomes complicated. You would need to say, yeah, just thinking about, for example, a single SharePoint site. You've got one site, you might have 3 libraries in it. In each library, you've got some folders and files. What you would have to do is check for every single item. So for the SharePoint site, for each library, for each file, each folder, has there been a change in permissions? Does Rene have access to it or not? That's obviously not going to work that you do that manually and programmatically. Yeah, you could try to create a PowerShell script that does that, but yeah, again, it doesn't scale properly, obviously. It might work to say, yeah, we can run it against a single site and get a report, but what if you've got 100 sites? What if you've got 1,000 sites, 10,000 sites? And running a report against that large number of sites, especially then when you've got maybe even a couple of thousand, 10,000, 100,000 files over there, it's going to run and run and run and run. And at some point, yeah, you will not be able to basically get a detailed, good report on time. You will not be able to say, hey, Rene has got access to all these environments, but rather, yeah, we try to check it and we're not quite sure what he has access to. So not something that is obviously the strength here within Office 365. If you want to figure out what I did recently, that's a bit of a slightly better story. So within the compliance portal, I think it's the brand new name, the Microsoft Purview compliance portal, you've got the audit logs. And what you can do is then you can go in there and then say, yes, for a specific date and time range, I want to specify what a certain person has been doing and see basically what he did there. I can say, for example, for those activities, I want to narrow it down maybe just to some certain file operations, like, oh, did Rene delete something? Did he access something, modify something? And that's about it. And I can then basically get a detailed report that tells me then, okay, Rene accessed this file at this time from this IP address, and he viewed another file an hour later, something like that. That's what can be done. Drawback of that is obviously that, not really obviously, but drawback here is that we're working within a very limited time frame here, actually. So we can't say, hey, what did Rene do actually in January this year? Because the logs don't go back that far actually right now by default. So you could try to extend it a bit, but there are limits how far back you can go. So if you ask, what did Rene do a year ago? You wouldn't even know basically by default, because those logs are long gone. So if you think Rene did something last year, you wouldn't know about it today anymore. And yeah, overall now we're talking about guests, where do they have access to, what have they been doing, etc. Who's actually responsible for that? Is it IT? Is it the content owners? Is it compliance? And obviously there's usually a lot of finger pointing, because the content owners say, hey, I don't know anything technically about how that's getting done. I don't know how that works. IT should do it. IT obviously is not the one who's responsible for the content. They don't know if somebody should have access or not. They might say, yeah, there should be some compliance details, some compliance reports, etc. But compliance also says, hey, we tell you what should be done, but we're not telling you specifically, again, who should be doing what exactly. And yeah, basically, it's a combination, you could say, in the end, obviously, of all the three. In the end, there's still a certain responsibility from the content owner's side. So if I share a file with somebody, it should be my responsibility to make sure that that somebody still requires access to it after 3 months, 6 months. If not, I should remove that access. But IT should also basically allow me to review that access easily, because if I ask IT, as just mentioned, hey, what does Rene have access to? And IT says, I don't know, then yeah, I also can't do any reviews in detail. Good. So we're approaching slowly the end of my slide deck here. Just to wrap up a bit, so I hope you got some good ideas overall on what should be done with external users to govern and manage them, also how to allow sharing with them. Now, there are a few different ways how you can overall approach the different tasks that are involved. So you've seen, okay, when it comes to the whole aspect of sharing, you need to think about how do you allow sharing, to which extent, do you want to put some guardrails in place, do you want to control it a lot, do you want to control it a little? But also then for the users that get invited, what do you do with them? Once they're invited, should they just be there and do what they are allowed to do right now? Should there be some review of their activities regularly? Should there be a review of what they have access to? Should they do a review of if they should even still be needed to go to your system? Those kind of things. You should identify first, obviously, what's more important to you. So you might say, yeah, there are certain things that are really important to us right now. We don't need to know actually exactly who all those externals are and what they are doing, but we want to make sure that we control, for example, what kind of content gets shared in our organization. We don't just want anonymous links to be generated, but rather we put some guardrails in place to prevent that, for example. You also then obviously need to define all the governance controls soonest. So you want to improve really your security and compliance rating, and the key part here is really the security. As mentioned, for example, sharing with anyone is always a risk. So you want to control, yeah, I'm sharing only with named people. And maybe you even want to say those named people are then some people that we have a review process on. And lastly, obviously, then you also need to think about how can you report on all of that, because in a way, obviously, if you put all those wonderful controls in place, you still need to know actually what is happening in a way. So you need to know how many people there are, what they are doing, potentially, all those kind of things, because you also want to move the management aspect of it and all your operational tasks here. So the very conclusion of it is then the management of guest canon should be automated. So we've seen basically that ideally people should be allowed to invite externals in most cases, but once those externals are in your system, you want to do ideally some periodic review again, because again, you don't just want the number of externals to grow and grow and grow and grow, and suddenly you end up with 50,000 externals invited to your environment, even though maybe only 10,000 should be there. So again, that management should be automated in a way so they don't have to manually report on everything, etc. It's also difficult to get insights for access reporting. So I just basically mentioned briefly the Microsoft Purview audit log, but you get more information about not just what people have been doing, but also where they have access to, for example, those kind of things. You need to carefully think about how valuable that information is to you. If you say, yeah, we don't care, then obviously it's a low priority for you. But most people really want to figure out, if I invite Rene to my tenant, what is he doing there? What is he allowed to do? Where does he have access? What does he have access to? So for something like that, you might then actually really consider a third-party tool to help you with that. You really want to simplify some of your activities. I mentioned, for example, that there are certain controls in place, controls available to you in Azure AD that you could implement with conditional access policies, etc. That might be a bit too complicated or too much. You might also put in some controls in place, for example, to do periodic reviews of externals. But that's something where then say, yeah, if I try to do it by myself and glue something together, maybe possible with a smaller number, but the larger number is obviously the better it is to have some dedicated tool usually that can help you with it. And yeah, that brings me then to the end of the presentation here. So we're going to have a short demo by Syskit, and afterwards I'm still around for a short Q&A if there are any questions, so I can have a look at it.
Okay, thank you, Rene, for the awesome presentation. Just a kind reminder for everyone that if you have any questions for Rene, feel free to submit them for our Q&A session. But before that, we are going to turn things over to Syskit Product Development Lead, Mattia, for a quick demo on how Syskit Point can help improve your management of both external and internal users. Also, there is a Syskit Point case study available to download in the handout section of the Go to Webinar. But let's now turn things to Mattia. Mattia, are you ready?
Yeah. Patrick, can you just confirm that you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Rene. So it was a really enjoyable webinar so far. So for those of you who are new to Syskit Point, it's a management tool for Office 365. Basically, it will give you a comprehensive report on everything that is happening inside your environment in a centralized location. So it covers different services like Azure AD, SharePoint Online, Microsoft 365 groups, teams, and so on. And it can basically bridge the gap between IT and business users as it automates governance, but assigning different kind of tasks to the business owners. So basically, you can delegate the part of the responsibility to secure your content to the business owners, and those are the people that actually have like operational knowledge on what should be shared with whom. So you can automate things like external user reviews or access by external users and stuff like that. So we are limited on time, so let's jump straight into the demo. So this is Syskit Point. First thing I want you to notice that basically I'm logged in as a global administrator, so I see everything on the tenant. So Rene told you that comprehensive reporting for external users is not easy. So let's see how it's done by Syskit Point. So simply I can click on sites. I get a list of all the sites, all the teams, even OneDrives. I can just select externally shared. And as simple as that, I can see the number of external users on each site or team. And even from here, you might be asking, so who are the users? What do they have access to? So you can simply select a few of them or all of them and generate additional reports like externally shared content, where you can actually see, okay, so this is the team, Aldo is a team member of Project Mars. And even different scenarios where only a single file is shared. Let's say inside the QA team, you have the documents and a single file which is shared with Eva. You can also see that we pick up anonymous access links and also different kinds of sharing links. So there could be either specific people access links, anonymous links, or even direct access. So everything is covered by Syskit Point. So now we've seen how easy it is from the site perspective, but if you want to start from the user perspective, you want to check, okay, how many external users do I have? You simply go to users inside Syskit Point. Once again, in a single click, you can just filter all of the external users. You can even add additional data here like email. So you can easily filter by domain like Syskit.com. You see all the users, and you see all the users in Azure AD. And even what Rene did not mention, there are different kinds of users which even do not have AAD accounts. And that happens when you share only a single file with them. So you can notice the difference. The ones in the AD have this ext in the username, while the ones that do not exist in the AAD have this URN SPO guest accounts. So from here, you can simply click on any guest user. You can see all the teams where that guest user is a member of. You can see if he has been doing anything lately, and you can also check all of the sites. And what's pretty cool, if you go to details, you can basically see all the files that Alex has access. How did he get access? And if you want to remove it, you can simply do it from here. So as easy as that. And what's also pretty cool, if you go back to Alex, you can even check what Alex has been doing. So you get the user activity. It's basically the same audit logs that Rene showed you, but here inside Syskit Point, you do not have that time limitation. So you can go back as far as you wish. So you can see what the user has done last year, so without any issues. Okay, so remember, all of this that I've shown you now was basically in the context of the global admin. So now I'm going to quickly switch to another browser, and here I'm actually Cork Blanc. So Cork is not in IT, Cork is actually in marketing. So Syskit Point will basically give tasks to Cork, and one of those tasks will be to perform permission reviews. And he can simply click here or simply go to Syskit Point where he can see his tasks. And on these permission reviews, let's just focus on that. He gets a list of all the teams where he is the owner, and he has to go to each team. Basically, he sees for some basic information, and he sees all the members. So who are the guest members inside this team? And all of these screens can be customized. Maybe you just want to see guest users here, not internal. That's possible. So he can validate if those users should be removed. And this is even more powerful because on the next step, he can even see files which have been shared with external users who are not members of that team. He can simply click on this filter and he can see here, okay, so Eva, who is not a member of this team, actually has some files shared. So this is a nice automation which will keep basically your environment safe because it will force all the users, all the owners to review regularly access. And there's also one different kind of task where we basically, Syskit Point can, on the criteria you define, like inactivity of external users, can assign a task once again to Cork. Hey, Cork, you invited Victoria, but that user is no longer active. And once again, you get a task. You can simply go to Syskit Point. And here you can just say, okay, I still need this user to have access, or it's okay to remove Victoria. And all of these automations have a lot of options, a lot of ways to customize it. Basically, this is just a small point of Syskit Point that I'm actually showing you, and there's a lot of more capabilities. So basically, that's what we have on the today's demo. If you want to learn more, definitely get in touch and we can do a full demo for you. Patrick, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mattia. This was an excellent presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A session with Rene. So please feel free to ask anything using the Q&A function. So please don't be shy. Rene, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Paulo. So thank you very much for submitting your question. So he's asking, do I block Teams sharing to external partners if I change SharePoint to least permissive, that is only people in my organization? So basically, he doesn't allow external access to SharePoint online, but okay for Teams group.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? I couldn't hear the first part.
Yeah, sure. So he's asking, does he block Teams sharing to external partners if he changes the SharePoint to least permissive, that is only basically people in his organization?
Okay, now I get it. Yeah. So basically, you want to say you still allow sharing through Teams that people can access it, but for SharePoint, you want to say no. That's then only within the organization people are allowed. That's a very good question, actually. My understanding is that this is still possible, actually. This is one of those questions that makes me wonder what actually happens when we do that. I've never tested that before, and I've never seen it before either. As we know, basically, the concern is Team stores the files in the SharePoint side that is associated with the team. So if we disallow sharing SharePoint sites, then are those SharePoint sites that are powered by Teams also affected? My understanding right now was actually no, that's handled, you could say, through Teams still, so it's not impacted that way. But I'm happy to be corrected on that. Patrick, if you've got any other idea on that.
Yeah, maybe we can get back to Paulo as well to go a little bit further into this detail. Yeah, kind of an interesting scenario that we can explore for sure. Yeah, so great question, Paulo. Thank you very much for that. The next would be from Shakti. So thank you very much for submitting your question. He's saying that you mentioned about policies in SharePoint Online Admin Center, and he's asking, can access package and identity governance? Just 1 second, let me just better improve my view here on the question. Sorry about that. So yes, so he's asking, can access package and identity governance improve external collaboration?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure if I understand that question correctly. So the more I think about it, there might be even a few different ways how that could be understood, or maybe I'm just overthinking it. Yes, my apologies. I'm struggling right now to fully grasp the scope of that question. So if you can add some additional detail on that in the chat again, then I would happy to try to answer it again, Saktish.
Yeah. So please, submit with further details, and then we can help you clarify your question. There is also an additional question from Stefan Custer. So thank you very much again for submitting your question. Is there an inventory built for all guest users where they have access, or is it a live view?
Okay, today's really a tricky question day because I'm also not entirely sure I understand that one with the live view. Do you have any idea what that might mean, Patrick?
Yeah, maybe we can also ask for Stefan, please, if you could maybe add some additional information, then we can best address your question.
That's the drawback of having things online. Obviously, in person, it makes it easier to have a quick back and forth and clarify it. Yeah,
dig deeper on the information for sure.
I'm still going to be around, everyone, so I'm not going to leave in 2 minutes or so. Happy to stay as long as required, so don't worry about that part.
Yeah, so please feel free to add additional information or on your questions, and also anyone that has any questions, just let us know by submitting through the Q&A function. While we maybe give another minute or so to receive additional information, there is also a standard question, can I make a guest user automatically expire based on inactivity or end date of a project with the out-of-the-box Microsoft 365 features?
So that obviously then depends on how do you know, for example, a certain project ends. So that's the tricky part. So yes, you can have certain expiry dates that you say something needs to happen after a certain amount of time. I'm not quite sure if there's anything actually out of the box directly available, but there are ways how it could be controlled and through some additional mechanisms that allow you then to expire after a certain period of time then, and that could be then potentially achieved. My concern is just around that after a project expires. So ideally, you would go in and say, for example, okay, for guest X, he should expire after, I don't know, I'm just going to say, for example, the 1st of January 2023 or so. That might be the ideal state that you can define it then for a new person where you can then basically do that. There are ways how it can be done generally, but I think out of the box, there's nothing directly available that I can think of right now that would work in such a way that you can then specify, for example, the specific date by when an account should expire.
Yeah, I appreciate the input. Yeah, so this is something also that, again, our tools also could help you there. So if there are any need to validate the activity of your guest users, Syskit Point is a solution that could play a part here. So Stefan actually just submitted some additional information. So he's asking if are you doing a periodic inventory to show the objects, SharePoint sites where a guest user have access? Or do you ad hoc display when going inside a site from the dashboard which external guests are member of a team?
Okay, so now I get it. Okay, that's basically a Syskit product specific question then around, do you some live reporting or do you do some reporting on some stored
maybe
data or
Mattia
cache?
then
So
can.
I'm just gonna let you
Yeah,
guys
yeah,
then.
I can jump in for that. Basically, so it's not live, but it's continuously updated in the background. So if it would be live, then you could maybe do it for 100 of sites, but with the way we do it, with continuous scanning in the background, you can do it for hundreds of thousands of sites.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And thank you, Stefan, for adding additional clarification. So Shakti also had some additional clarification. I hope that helps us help him with the question. So he's asking, is Azure Access Packages and Azure Identity Governance for external collaboration better than SharePoint Online Policies, which you had mentioned from governance perspective?
Okay, so better is obviously a tricky thing to say. My understanding overall is that you've got obviously a lot more possibilities and capabilities generally within Azure. So if you look at what's possible within for example, the Office 365 admin centers, for example, when you look at what's there in the SharePoint admin center, there are some possibilities there that you can then define, etc. But it's relatively, I don't call it simple, obviously, because it's not just a very small thing, but it's relatively again, limited might also not be the right word, but it's small in scope. Let's call it that way, small in scope. Whereas within Azure, then obviously you can define a whole lot more. And we've seen, for example, the zero trust architecture slide that had a whole lot of additional activities and a whole lot of additional controls that you can put in place. So when it comes to, for example, the whole identity management aspect of Azure AD and putting in conditional access controls and, for example, certain access packages to define who should have access to what and which conditions, etc. There's a whole lot more that you can define there. Obviously, it makes it also a bit more complicated and complex. It's not something that a small organization can set up. But definitely, if you've got the means to take care of it, you should definitely look into it as well. I'm not going to say, okay, you should do either or, but rather you need to basically check which one is best for your organization in a way then, because for some organizations, what can be done in, for example, the SharePoint Admin Center, that's more than enough. That's perfect for them. But some might require additional controls because of, again, for example, the legal nature of the company where they say, oh, we need to have certain controls in place that content cannot be accessed from, I don't know, again, unmanaged devices or certain locations or other things. And maybe you have some specific SharePoint sites that cannot be accessed by externals at all. It can only be accessed from the internal network, not even from the cloud directly, but rather need to be on VPN or so. So yes, in such scenarios, then basically you need to check then what else can be done within the capabilities of Azure AD and the other basically Azure related capabilities.
Okay, I appreciate the reply, Rene. So yeah, we got quite additional questions. So I appreciate everyone that submitted. Unfortunately, we are over our time, so we will address them later on. So just to make sure that everyone has their answers. So Rene, any final words before we end?
Not really too much. I mean, just a very short comment again. We've seen some of the things that people should be looking at within the organization regarding the management governance of users, external users, and sharing content with them. And just from a personal point of view, I mean, don't be too scared to look at how much that you can automate could also be done through some other tools, because there's a certain threshold. Once you cross that, then you realize you've got so many more users, so many more sites to manage, etc., that the workload becomes a lot. And sometimes it makes it easier than to look at something like, for example, a Syskit product that can help you. And speaking from experience, I mean, sometimes you just want something else to do the job for you, so you can focus on what's important, so they're not constantly responding to other people's requests, but rather, again, basically asking other people, then colleagues, to access a certain site, confirm access, done, take care of everything, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Yeah.
Okay. Once again, thank you, Rene, for the awesome presentation. Once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone who registered for this event will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. So yeah, it was a pleasure having you all. And you have any further questions regarding Syskit Point or any of our products, please reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.